We're starting a new read aloud today. We will begin reading Who Was Frederick Douglass by April Jones Prince. And so we are going to learn about this very famous abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. Who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born a slave. Just like a horse or a plow, he was the property of a white man. From a young age, Frederick wondered why that was so. Wasn't he as smart, strong, and deserving of liberty as anyone else? At the time Frederick was born in 1818, there were 1.5 million enslaved black people in the southern United States. Most didn't learn to read. This was against the law. But Frederick taught himself to read and write. Most enslaved people didn't risk their lives to run away to freedom. This was against the law too. But Frederick escaped and helped others do the same. Most escaped slaves did not speak out against slavery. It was very dangerous to do so. But Frederick spoke up anyway. With words as his weapons, Frederick spent his life fighting for equal rights for all people. He was the father of the civil rights movement. Chapter 1: Born into Slavery. The man who became famous as Frederick Douglass was born in a log hut on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1818. His name at birth was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Frederick's mother, Harriet, was enslaved, which meant Frederick was too. They were owned by a man named Aaron Anthony. They called him Captain Anthony, or Old Master. Who was Frederick's father? It may have been Captain Anthony. Frederick never knew for sure. Captain Anthony owned 3 farms and enslaved about 30 people. He also managed the farms of a very rich man named Edward Lloyd. The Lloyd family owned 13 farms and enslaved more than 500. Captain Anthony lived on the Lloyd's main farm, White House Plantation. Some of Captain Anthony's slaves lived there with him. Others, including members of Frederick's family, were spread out across other farms. Frederick's mother worked long hours in Captain Anthony's fields, or in those of a neighbor who rented her. Frederick saw his mother only 4 or 5 times in his life. Instead, he lived with his grandparents, Isaac and Betsy Bailey. Isaac was a free black man, but Betsy was enslaved. Her job was to care for her many young grandchildren until they were old enough to work. As a child, Frederick enjoyed fishing in a nearby stream and watching squirrels scamper about. His grandparents' windowless cabin, with its clay floor and dirt and straw chimney, was small and rough, but to Frederick it held the attractions of a palace. Then one day, Betsy brought him to work at Captain Anthony's. Betsy kept the reason for their journey a secret so as not to upset young Frederick. It was a 12-mile walk, so his strong grandmother had to tote him on her shoulders now and then. In the heat of the afternoon, they finally arrived at the grandest building Frederick had ever seen. White House was white, with stately pillars and a neatly trimmed lawn. The plantation sat on the Wye River and was like its own little village, with barns, stables, kitchens, blacksmiths, and shoemakers' shops, and more. Captain Anthony lived in a separate house on the property. Slavery in America. Slavery had been part of American history since early colonial days. The first blacks were kidnapped from their homelands in West Africa and brought to Virginia by ship in 1619. The slave trade continued for almost 200 years until it was outlawed in 1808. No new slaves could be brought into the country after this time, but existing slaves had children. By 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in the southern states, where large wheat, cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice plantations depended on slave labor. In the north, where farms were smaller, slavery was not as common or as profitable. For this and other reasons, slavery in the north gradually died out. Rowdy enslaved children surrounded Frederick when he arrived at White House. Frederick's grandmother introduced him to his brother and two sisters, whom he'd never met. Betsy encouraged Frederick to play with the children, and he finally reluctantly joined them. Sometime later, one of them ran up and hollered, "Fed, Fed, Grandmommy gone." Frederick raced to the kitchen to see for himself. Betsy was indeed gone for good. Almost heartbroken at the discovery, Frederick later wrote, "I fell upon the ground and wept a boy's bitter tears." It was the first time he experienced the cruelty of slavery. One morning soon after Frederick was sleeping in a rough kitchen closet, suddenly he woke to the terrible shrieks of his Aunt Hester. Old Master was whipping Hester for spending time with her boyfriend. Frederick watched through the cracks in the closet door. He never forgot the horrific scene. From that day on, Frederick hated slavery with all his heart and soul. Because Frederick was still too young to work in the fields, he ran errands, looking after the cows and chickens, and kept the front yard clean. It wasn't hard labor, not anything like hoeing, planting, weeding, and harvesting crops from sunup to sundown. He wasn't often whipped or beaten, but he was cold and hungry. In hottest summer and coldest winter, Frederick remembered, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse tow linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. Frederick slept on the dirt floor of the kitchen closet without a bed or blanket. On the coldest nights, he climbed inside a corn sack to try to keep warm. The hunger was even worse. Aunt Katy was a cold-hearted slave who looked after the enslaved children. She served cornmeal mush in a long trough placed on the ground. The strongest children got the most food, but even that wasn't much. Sometimes Frederick's belly was so empty he fought the dog for crumbs that fell from the table where Aunt Katy prepared food for Captain Anthony's family. One day Aunt Katy made Frederick go the whole day without food. That night he quietly plucked a few grains from an ear of Indian corn. He was roasting the grains by the fire when his mother appeared on one of her few visits. Harriet was furious when she learned that her son had not eaten. She gave Aunt Katy a fiery lecture and replaced Frederick's corn with a heart-shaped ginger cake. In the care of his mother, Frederick felt like a king, but when morning came, his mother was gone. He never saw her again. Harriet died shortly thereafter, though no one bothered to tell Frederick until some time later. Thankfully, better days were ahead. Chapter 2, Baltimore. At White House, Frederick ran errands for Miss Lucretia, Captain Anthony's daughter. Sometimes when Frederick was especially hungry, he would stand beneath Miss Lucretia's window and sing. Miss Lucretia often rewarded him with a piece of bread. This small act of kindness was like a sunbeam in young Frederick's life. Frederick had been at White House about 2 years when Miss Lucretia and her husband, Thomas Auld, sent Frederick off to Baltimore, Maryland. Frederick would live with Thomas's brother, Hugh Auld, and his wife, Sophia. It would be Frederick's job to run errands and look after the couple's 2-year-old son, Tommy. Frederick was thrilled. He was only 8, but he was bright and curious. He had always wondered about life in the big city. Before leaving, Frederick spent the better part of 3 days in the creek, scrubbing. Miss Lucretia gave him his first pair of trousers. Trousers or pants. And so here's Baltimore. And way over here is the Y plantation. So he's going to go from way out here in the Y plantation to Baltimore. And then if he had gone over here, that would be Washington, D.C., the capital of the country. On a Saturday morning, Frederick boarded a boat at the White House wharf, hoping never to see the plantation again. For a boy who had always lived in the country, the city of Baltimore was overwhelming. With more than 60,000 residents, Baltimore was one of the largest cities in the United States. Tall brick buildings shut out the sky. Delivery wagons crowded the busy streets as they headed to and from the harbor. The sun beat down on the hard brick pavements, almost blistering Frederick's bare feet. A ship's hand brought Frederick to his new home. The Auld family met Frederick at the door. Frederick loved little Tommy at once, and he was surprised by the kind look on Sophia Auld's face. Mrs. Auld had never owned a slave, and she treated Frederick more like a son. For the first time in his life, Frederick slept in a bed with covers. He had good bread to eat and clean clothes to wear. He also discovered there were such things as books. He asked his mistress to teach him to read, and she did. In no time, Frederick had learned the alphabet and could spell short words. Proud of his progress, Sophia told her husband about it. Hugh Auld's response was swift and sure. He forbade his wife to teach Frederick any more. Not only was it against the law, he said, but an education would make an enslaved person want to escape. Mr. Auld was right. Frederick understood that knowledge was power. From that moment, Frederick said, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. From then on, whenever Frederick ran an errand, he carried a book and pieces of bread. He would do his errand quickly, then find a hungry white boy in the streets and trade bread for a lesson. When Frederick was 12, he bought his first book with 50 cents he had earned shining shoes in the street. The Columbian Orator was filled with speeches by famous people. One was a discussion between a master and an enslaved person, in which the enslaved person stated the many reasons why slavery was wrong. His points were so strong the master unexpectedly set him free. Frederick read this speech over and over. For him, however, freedom seemed to be forever out of reach. At the Aulds' house, Frederick began to hear the word abolition. He didn't know what this word meant. Master Hugh and his friends would bring it up when they were discussing slavery. A dictionary told Frederick that abolition meant the act of ending something. Then in a newspaper he found an article about the abolition of slavery. There were people, abolitionists, who wanted slavery to end. There were groups of abolitionists in northern states trying to help enslaved people escape to freedom. This was astounding news. Frederick began thinking about how to run away to the north. He was around 13, too young to plan an escape, but the thought gave him hope. Also, before he escaped, there was something important Frederick wanted to do: learn to write. With this ability, he might be able to write a fake permission slip from his master, allowing him to travel north safely. Frederick practiced writing using chalk on fences and pavement. Later, Frederick copied letters in Tommy's old spelling book. Sometimes he worked late into the night after the family had gone to bed. It took years of hard work, but finally he learned to write. And so we learn about young Frederick and his very beginnings, the very first time he experiences true slavery, the time he sees another slave being beaten, the cruelty and neglect that slave children suffer, with no food, no clothes, nothing to protect them from the cold. And he experienced just a little bit of kindness from one master. But he had enough to know he wanted freedom. So we'll read chapter 3 next time.